So traditionally, the Gospel of John falls into sort of two rough parts. One concerns the public ministry of Jesus, and the other concerns his death. And the bulk of that material falls in the section that deals with his death. And traditionally, the break has been made at the end of chapter 12. But recently, it has been proposed that actually the end of Jesus' public ministry in the Gospel of John comes at the end of chapter 10. And chapters 11 and 12 form a bridge, a transition between Jesus' public ministry and the part that deals with matters pertaining to Jesus' death. And so the context in which our passage comes today follows on the story about the raising of Lazarus, a story about a decision taken by the Jewish religious authorities to kill Jesus, and then the story of Jesus being anointed at Bethany. And then comes the text about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And so that comes up to where James began to read in chapter 12, verse 20. And this little passage from verse 20 to verse 26, I think forms a hinge between in that section that is a transition. The hinge is in the verses that James read for us. It contains references to many of the themes that are woven throughout the Gospel of John. Notably, it has ideas about the hour, about glorification, about the cosmos, and then about the meaning of Christ's death, and ultimately what our death means as well. So the hour occurs many times in the various stories and discussions about Jesus. First occurs in the second chapter of John. You remember perhaps the story of the wedding in Cana. And they run out of wine. And Mary says to Jesus, well, you should do something about it. And Jesus says to her, woman, my hour has not yet come. But then he goes ahead and does something about the situation, which is to multiply a little bit of wine into a whole lot of water, a little bit of water, no, a whole lot of water into a whole lot of wine. In chapter 7, there's a plot to have Jesus arrested and killed, and the narrator tells us that it doesn't happen because Jesus' hour has not yet come. But notice that in this passage, this hinge passage, all of a sudden, Jesus' hour has come. And what seems to trigger this event? Well, the gospel tells us that among those who went up to worship in Jerusalem, and this was the festival of Passover, were some Greeks. And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and they said to him, Sir, we want to see Jesus. And then Philip went and told Andrew, and then Philip and Andrew went to Jesus together. And Jesus, we don't hear what they said to him. Jesus says to them, the hour has come in order that the human one may be glorified. So this is Jesus' way of talking about his death, because the hour is this hour when God's love will be made manifest most clearly in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So who are these Greeks? And why do they completely disappear from the story at this point? So there are a couple of suggestions, both of them from respectable scholars, and both of them adopted one way or another, and various scholars fight very hard for whichever position they adopt. One position is that these are some Gentile Greeks who are part of a community known as the God-fearers, people who are attracted to various aspects of Judaism and who participate in certain of its rituals. This is why there is in the temple in Jerusalem the court of the Gentiles. The other position, which I find more appealing, is that these Greeks were actually Jews from Greece, or Hellenistic Jews, part of the larger Hellenistic community, who had come from wherever they lived to participate fully in the celebration of Passover. Why do I think they might be Jews? Well, it hinges on a couple of things. And I'm following here the work of William Countryman. He argues that in the so-called shepherd discourses in chapter 10, Jesus talks about having other flocks who are not of this fold. And so he thinks that perhaps this is a reference to Greek Jewish communities. He feels it's more likely that Jesus would be connected with Greek Jews than with Greek Gentiles. But I think a stronger argument that he produces is that the community in which this gospel, the Gospel of John, originated was a Greek community. And so this is meant to be something of a statement about the history of the community, which was Greek-speaking, but apparently originated from a community of Greek-speaking Jews. Notice, too, that the disciples to whom these Greeks come are Philip and Andrew, the two disciples with Greek-sounding names. They are also the two disciples who first bring other disciples to Jesus. So Philip brings his friend Nathanael, and Andrew brings his brother Simon, who becomes Peter. So the coming of Philip and Andrew to Jesus with this request from the Greeks to see him triggers Jesus saying, "The hour has arrived." So Jesus senses in this something about the nature of this is an expansion beyond the Hebrew-speaking, the Aramaic-speaking community, which he has so far been connected with. Also, the talk about the glorification of the human one is Jesus' way of talking about his crucifixion and pointing beyond that to the resurrection. So the glorification in the Gospel of John, which is a very different approach than in the Synoptic Gospels, talks about Jesus being raised up. Now, you may remember last week there was this strange story about the snake, the serpent on the pole that the people looked at in order to be healed. So, and the analogy was drawn to Jesus being lifted up on the cross. So for John, Jesus' glorification is being raised on the cross, being crucifixion, and then raised from the dead in resurrection. So those are two themes that carry over from this point on into further discussion of Jesus' death. Another Johannine theme that's picked up in this text is the theme of cosmos, which is often translated as world. But when we read in the text that you have to, where is it here? The person who loves their self destroys it, and the one who hates their self in this cosmos, in other words, in this world. We have tended often to read these kind of texts as being about in this life that we're living here on earth, as opposed to another life that we will live in heaven or something when we die. We talk about eternal life. And so we contrast life in this world and life, an eternal life after death. When Jesus uses this language, when John uses this language, that's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about life in the social and economic and political and cultural and religious time in which he's living. That is to say, in the Roman Empire. And he contrasts that cosmos with the reign of God. So it's two competing, if you like, realms in the same time frame. So when Jesus is talking about the reign of God, he's really talking about an alternate way of looking at things, an alternate way of organizing the world. The Greek word cosmos, which we now use to refer to the entire universe and the way it's organized, actually has its roots in the idea of order. It's also the word that gives us our English word cosmetic. So it is made to appear in a certain way. So in John's gospel, the word cosmos is nearly always negative. It refers to a system driven by violence, domination, and death. And it's a system that holds us captive, leads in the way of death rather than the way of life. It's what we are now beginning to talk about when we talk about systems theory, when we talk about systemic racism or systemic anyism. It relies for its existence on violence and the abuse of power. Its existence is sustained by something called the myth of redemptive violence, which says that the only way to bring order out of chaos is by violent defeat of the enemy. The system the cosmos in which we exist now tends to divide us into us and them, white and black, poor and rich, healthy and not healthy. Jesus' rejection of violence all the way to the cross is what distinguishes his way from the way of the Roman Empire, the way of the system that was in place in his cosmos. So when he stands before Pilate, and Pilate says to him, "So you're a king," Jesus replies, my reign is not of this cosmos. So then we come to what is essentially the core of this passage. In truth, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat which has fallen into the earth dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The person who loves their self destroys it. And the one who hates their self in this cosmos preserves it into authentic life. That's my translation for what is often translated as eternal life. And this is a tricky passage to translate because the word that's used for, in Greek, the word psyche, is sometimes translated here as life or as soul, or as I've translated it here, self. And I think that if we look back to the analogy Jesus draws to the grain of wheat, we can see perhaps a little better what he means by what follows. Now, a grain of wheat thrown on the ground, sown in the earth, doesn't die. It is transformed. But it's not the same anymore. Is it a grain of wheat when we see those stalks coming up from the ground and the heads opening up? Well, no. It's one of those caterpillars that spins a chrysalis and then emerges as a butterfly. Does the caterpillar die? I would say it's transformed. It seems to me what Jesus is getting at here is if you hold too tightly to the form in which you understand yourself to be, the way the influences of society and your own impulses, including godly impulses, if you hold too tightly to what is, then you let go of any chance of becoming what you are meant to be, what you can be. So if you hold on tightly to yourself, you give up your life. But if you hate yourself, and the key here is, if you hate yourself in this cosmos, in this way of structuring the world, then you preserve the great gift that you are, the creature of God that you are, into authentic life, life in all its fullness. And it is this transformation, this reformation of who we are in God's image, at God's hands. That is the transformation that leads us from seed to fruit, from caterpillar to butterfly. I think this is what the passage in Jeremiah is about. This passage about God making a new covenant, and this time writing the covenant, first of all, in the midst of the community, and then in the heart of every person. And so I want to read to you a passage from one of the resources I found this week. It talks about this idea of new covenant in this way of transformation. The idea of a new covenant, a new way of being that calls us to die in order to live, may sound way too spiritual and esoteric to really have anything to do with life in the real world. But it is, in fact, exactly what we need. We need to die to the economic systems built on unlimited greed and consumption in order to find a new way to live and use our wealth based on a more sustainable society. We need to die to short-sighted, expedient exploitation of the world's natural resources, and I might say human resources as well, for our own gain, in order to make a new covenant with the earth and find a way to live on our planet with responsibility and restraint. We need to die to our false sense of disconnection with others or from others, and die to our aggressive, protectionist tribalism in order to build a new, connected, respectful, and equitable world. We need to die to our lack of compassion for the poor, the sick, and the oppressed in order to work more intentionally and consistently for justice for all. In so many ways, the world as we know it, our current covenant with each other, with God and with the earth, is inadequate. Our current laws and traditions are unable to deal with the challenges we now face. Our organizations and institutions are hopelessly ill-equipped to navigate the complexity of our society. But to bring about the needed change will require a death, the death of the seed falling into the earth. We cannot build a new way of being without letting go of the old. We can't, as we're beginning to discover, we can't just tweak the systems. We need to release them, let them go, and endure the pain and the death that will result. Death, birth, and change all result in times of chaos before order emerges. Unless we can embrace this chaos, this dying to live, we will just continue to do things as we always have done. And in the process, we will lose our lives. But if we are willing to follow Christ, risk the new covenant, and lose our lives, We will discover a new life, a new world waiting for us. Jesus said, if anyone would serve me, let them follow me. Where I am, my servant will be as well. Amen. And Natalie Sleep has said it all very poetically in the hymn that is printed in your order, number 703, Voices United. In the bulb, there is a flower. In the seed, an apple tree. In cocoons, a hidden promise. Butterflies will soon be free. In the cold and snow of winter, there's a spring that waits to be, unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see. The hour is come.